Hello. It's the end of August 2022. And while there is a process by which I select the lectures month to month in terms of topics for Pathwork steps, sometimes that process is very, very subtle. It's a matter of finding very subtle threads in the work that people that I work with do to try to figure out what will support them in their next step or stage. This last 3 months has been unique. Back in May, I decided to do for June AD6, Additional Material 6, Stages of Commitment. Now there's a video on that lecture, and there's 3 videos at this point on what happened because of that lecture. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So not going to go into AD6, but it's about commitment. And when I looked at that lecture, I knew that when you talk about commitment, people are going to say, now what? Now what do we do? So I tried to look ahead into July, and I decided to use Pathwork Lecture 185, which is on mutuality. So while I was working on AD6, I was also working with and on mutuality. And I realized fairly quickly that mutuality was very timely for, once again, the people I work with. It seemed to be something that would fit their needs very, very well, fit into their needs well. And when that happens, a lecture expands. You can take any single lecture and do an entire weekend workshop on it. You could do a week. Depends on how you want to work with it. So when I try to do a single lecture in a single month, I'm truncating. I'm trying to introduce the concept. I'm trying to introduce the lecture. I don't try to cover every single aspect of the lecture in that month. When I got to mutuality, it just began to tumble and expand, and I realized it was a 2-month project. And so I decided to commit both July and August to the topic of mutuality. During the time I was prepping for the lecture on commitment, I also decided that it would be nice if I could demonstrate mutuality. If there was some practical way the meetings could reflect mutuality, more so than being facilitated by me. And so I asked for volunteers and got a group that met with me for 6 weeks during the AD6 study period. And our goal was to prepare little 15-minute meditation energy exercise presentations that I'd been doing for a while in the groups, reserving the last bits of time for something a little bit different. And so they prepped for that, they rehearsed for that, we filmed some of them. And then during the first month on mutuality, they stepped in and they did the last section. If they didn't do it live, then we had their recorded versions and used that. And it felt to me like that was integrating the concept of mutuality into our very meetings. I feel that there is mutuality in the meetings, but that's me, and some people need a little bit more emphasis to see something. So I thought that participation by their classmates, by their group peers, would have a stronger impact. And I think that happened. So that by the end of the first section on mutuality, some of that group was ready to take their commitments. They'd been working on that as well in the subgroup with me. And that was how we got relatively quickly to the stages of commitment ceremonies. Most of the people involved had been part of that subgroup. So that we had one the end of July, which was the first part of mutuality, and 2 during August. when I opened it up. And I said, we did one. If you'd like, if anybody else would like it, we'll do that. Once again, so that it wasn't just me facilitating one-on-one with people, which has worked quite well since 2016, but it's always nice to have something different, at least for a period of time. So that was the practical way that I chose to bring in a sense of mutuality into the meetings, more interaction, more participation, more co-leadership to some degree. So that's the introduction to the sequence. That's why I picked them. That's how these lectures and months and all these videos interrelate, because now there will be a total of 5 videos in 3 months, 3 ceremonies, AD6 and this. So that perhaps will give you a flavor of how relevant this lecture felt to the groups at hand. And they agreed, they tracked with me during those 2 months. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go over the 8 segments. And I do this because if you've got a 12, 16-page lecture and it goes into various topics, sometimes you become a little dizzy and it's hard to remember what got discussed. There's no subheadings in the lectures. And so I go through and I create subheadings. This is about this, and this is about that. And then I try to create at least 4 blocks of topics so that they're more bite-sized. Everybody's always welcome to go listen to the lectures or read them. They don't necessarily need the study guide. They don't necessarily need the meetings. A very small percentage of my entire contact list actually attend the meetings. It's a large number, but it's a small percentage. So a lot of people just take these materials and they do whatever it is they do with them to hopefully prompt, promote, intrigue their own sense of self-study. So because they did 2 months, there were 8 subtopics. Some were repeated, but we would talk about it first and then go into it at depth. And that's what the lecture does sometimes. It'll mention something, talk about something else, and then it'll go back and enlarge a topic. So it was enjoyable to have so much space for something that is inherently pleasurable. Mutuality. The topic is pleasurable. The goal of mutuality is not necessarily community per se. It's not finding colleagues. It's not standing in a group of people. Mutuality is really energetic, which is why it felt so important to bring in new energy and new ways of expressing energy and different kinds of ways to meditate. Mutuality is an energy exchange. It's an opening from me to you and of you to me. It's imperfect. So your opening may be smaller than mine may be smaller than yours. And we each decide what feels comfortable for us. I remember once when I was part of a larger self-help program, they had an annual convention and it was very close to me. So I went and I walked into this huge hall and there must have been 500 people. I don't think I've ever been in a group of people. They were all standing and walking around. I don't think I've ever been in a group that large, that active, of people with positive energy. Honestly, it was overwhelming for me at the time. This is 30 odd years ago. And I went around and I listened. I didn't know anybody, but I would go around, I would listen to various conversations or see what was going on. And finally, it was almost as if I felt blown out of the room. I just couldn't stay in the energy anymore. Different people have that reaction to me. You're nice, Jan, little noisy energetically, little overactive for some people to sit next to relax with. It's not what they want. So in mutuality, it's really important to find what works for you and see if you can expand that so that you're not limited, but you honor that you have tastes, preferences, capacities. And overstretching our capacities can be done for a while. It's not inherently comfortable, and it may not be fun. So there are times when we will do the work, and then times we want to relax, let our hair down, enjoy people on a level that we don't feel strained on. So again, mutuality, this is an energy exchange. And sometimes we can say that that's what we're doing when we're not. And that's what gives certain words a bad name because they've been misused. We've been lied to about the words. Love is one of those words. If I say I love you, but my goal is to get what I want or to control you or to make you fit my agenda, that's not real love. We may not have enough words to find a phrase that fits that exactly, but it's not real love. It's not genuine, heartfelt love. It's mixed in with so many things that it may be hard to identify. Mutuality is very much like real love. It's a flow. And again, love is not perfect. Mutuality is not perfect. And we are not perfect. So you work with what you've got. You work with the energies of the people around you, the people you know, cultivate new relationships, and you shift over time to new groups depending on what fits your needs. So let me go back to these 4 or 8 subtopics. The guide speaks of mutuality as a cosmic or spiritual law. No argument about the reality of mutuality and how it affects us. It's like gravity. It is. So better to deal with it than dodge it or try to manipulate it. In that sense, the guide recommends it takes work to achieve higher and higher levels of mutuality. So the guide says you're going to need to visualize. This was a lecture we did several months ago, Pathway Lecture 210 on visualization. You need to visualize what you want because without that, you're going blindly, trying to find things. So you visualize something without a demand that you meet that goal today. That's too small a goal. You want a goal that will take you a while. You want a goal that is lofty and that will ask you to be even more of the best of yourself. So you visualize something and then you execute it. So only visualizing turns into fantasy, and only executing winds up into administrating and details and doing, rather than a seeking for this exchange of energy. The guide says that creation depends upon mutuality. This creation doesn't happen without mutuality. So that execution requires labor, investment, commitment, self-discipline. It's a multidisciplined thing to execute something, to get it done. It also involves a giving up of the limited ego consciousness. Now, ego is, there's 2 dozen lectures about ego in the lectures. And the guide addresses different angles of it at different times. In this lecture, he talked about a consciousness, the kind of the aspect of ego that is conscious but limited. What we're trying to do is we're trying to expand the limitations of our ego consciousness, what the ego is aware of. So just because it can't see something now doesn't mean it won't be able to later, but it may need to hold some space for itself to expand into that. Examples of ego consciousness, concern with appearance, focusing on superficial, focusing on if it looks like it, then it will hold the energy of it. Sometimes that is true. Sometimes that's not. So just dealing with superficial details does not finish something. It doesn't make it happen. It's not execution. So concern with appearance is an ego consciousness activity. It's what the ego can do, so it focuses on what it can do, versus what we've talked about in other lectures recently, and that is creating a partnership between the ego and your divine self. In effect, it's a marriage. You marry yourself. And one partner takes care of some aspects of the living arrangement, and the other partner takes care of other aspects. Everybody has a different mixture of that, unique to the individuals involved. Now, we are the individual, and yet the ego has different agendas, outlooks, limitations than the real self. And the real self can inspire, it can bring intuition, it can bring visualization, it cannot do. So there needs to be a baton pass, back and forth, a checking over your shoulder saying, how we doing? Now, the real self will never push, it will never try to take over, but the ego will try to take over tasks that are best done, if not only possible, by the real self. So that's focusing on concern for appearance. And the other attitude is, oddly enough, living by the error of a value system, rules and logic. In effect, that's the superficiality of the social, cultural structure. So meeting the culture's expectations is not inherently a mutuality, especially if you're withholding. So you can dot your I's and cross your T's and still not be in a place of mutuality. So this can hold you up. And since this is the ego's job to navigate these things, to decide what works and what doesn't, and where we can nudge a little bit, the ego can get over involved with the rules, regulations, with logic, with linear logic. Whereas the spiritual process is not linear. The example I use all the time is sailing. If you want to sail someplace, you've got to work with the wind. You've got to work with the wind, unless you motor over, which is a different kind of transportation. You've got to work with the wind depending on which way it's blowing, etc. And you have to tack back and forth. So to get someplace, you may have to head in the opposite direction to pick up a wind to take you in the direction you want to go. The process of spiritual development is very much like sailing, only we may not be able to get the weather report on which way the wind is blowing. And it's an abstract, spiritual is so abstract that we may lose our ability to connect to its energy. So we're sailing with an invisible power source that we don't fully understand. And this can be very frustrating. And so the ego will fall into what's easier. Appearance, value system, rules, and logic are easier to deal with than constantly having to deal with this invisible force that does change. So it's what there's a place where you need to be very loving to the ego. It's exhaustive sometimes. I've spent hours and hours, days, weeks trying to figure this out, and I don't know what's going on. And yet I know that every human being has had the experience of, I can't do something, I can't figure it out. You go have lunch, you go to a movie, you sit down and do something else. It comes to you. Spirituality is a non-linear process. And so we have to be connected somehow to that inner sense of power and direction. And it's a trial and error process, just like everything in life has been for you, a trial and error process. So the third week, the guide had also, he has a habit of saying this is parts 1, 2, and 3, and then he takes 1 and he goes into various things, and he goes to 2 and 3. So he was creating sections, and that was the first section. And then the second section, I felt was so large that the third section wound up being the focus of the entire second month. The second section was how mutuality manifests in human life. So that's all nice about the energy and spiritual tasks, but how does it manifest? And the guide talks about gradations of development. Now, when the guide talks about gradations of development, he does that a lot. It is not his intention to pigeonhole people. And this is not linear. So you have a little of this and a little of that. But you can very often identify where you are in your development as being first, second, or third. And the guide helps out. He says, if you're reading this lecture, if you're doing this path work, you're probably over here. And he's normally describing stages of development where we're usually in the middle. So the initial phases don't bring you to pathwork lectures particularly, but at some point you find pathwork lectures, and then there's some place to go with them. So perhaps he's just framing this in advance so that we have a sense of past, present, and future. And that's what it feels like in these stages that he's outlined in this lecture. So stage 1 is the human being who is least developed and still most enveloped in fear and misconceptions. Stage 2 is when the longing becomes stronger and more conscious. And those are the kinds of people I work with. They have a longing. They may not yet be able to give it words or flavor. Poets are good at that. Filmmakers, storytellers, artists, sculptors, painters. That's what they do for us. They help us capture feelings that we have a difficult time finding the words for. And so we align with that. We feel a real buddy quality. We feel I'm trying to avoid the word attachment. We feel a synergy between certain paintings, stories, situations, poems, just like we do with people, where this expresses something that I'm working on. And it's exciting to find that. When I was a freshman in high school, I had one of those teachers that blows your mind and opens you up to things. And he took us to an art exhibit. It was called the Johnson Collection. Why do I remember this from so long ago? Because it blew my mind. A lot of the artists who painted that collection were drawing things they were able to visualize things that most of us, it expresses a dream world, a dream we've had, a feeling we've had, a sensation we've had of multiple dimensions existing together. And the reason it blew my mind is being a young person, 14, 15 years old. I thought I was alone. I thought my confusion and my feelings and my problems were just me. And when you see a whole exhibit in a major museum dedicated to this, it's pretty obvious it's not just me, that other people appreciate seeing these. And anyway, I was overwhelmed. I suddenly had this feeling of kinship. I wasn't alone. Somebody understood, even if I don't ever speak to them. Their work tells me that they know something similar to what I know, but they have a better capacity to express it. So here I'm focusing on stage 2, where the longing becomes stronger, becomes more conscious, and it pulls us into both visualizing and executing. It pulls us into new activities. It It calls us to cross the street, cross the city, cross the country, cross the globe, trying to find out what it is that's calling us from the inside. So that's stage 2, and that's where most of the people I work with are. The third stage is the person who is relatively capable of sustaining actual mutuality. Now, I like that the guide uses words like relatively capable, okay? Because mutuality, after all, involves the other person, and they may change their mind. They may not be fully ready. They may have wanted to be ready, so they joined up with you, and then they couldn't hold that growth energy, that dynamic. And in effect, they drop out, but we don't always tell the other person that we dropped out. So relatively capable of sustaining actual mutuality includes figuring out partners to choose, relationships to go into, friendships, acquaintances, and allowing that these sometimes don't work out and we have to re-choose, rather than saying, darn, I did it once, I don't want to do it again. You have to work out because it's too much work trying to find a new friend. That's holding on to rules and logic, even appearance, rather than understanding that there's an organic process going on. And some people just need to sit down for a while, take a time out for a week, few months, few years. And that these relationships and mutualities are not in fantasy or longing and not in an as if. So we're not inventing a reality and pretending that that's what we have. We're able to see what the other person is able to offer. And we may have to step up more than we thought we would, fill in the blanks more than we had hoped. But we're not unrealistic about who they are, even if we're not perfectly aware of who they are. So that's mutuality in 3 gradations of development. Then in week 4, we looked at the energetic aspects of mutuality, which is why I was bringing people in to do various pieces of energy work. We looked at the yes and the no currents. There's a place where you really need to identify, you've got to know. It may be inconvenient, and other people may not like it, but no is no. And the idea is that by honoring the no and having a sit down and a talk to it, you might be able to help it shift. But by trying to overrule it, it just gets dug in and the resistance goes underground, just like in a group of people. If you think everybody's on the same page and you say, okay, let's go, some people are going to be dragging behind because they didn't actually agree, or they don't understand, or they're not sure. You thought you had agreement, but you didn't. So any degree of no needs to be looked at. We have to admit it, look at it, and work on it. Because if you cannot say no when you need to, your yes isn't real. That's a mantra that I memorized many years ago with the help of these lectures. That whether or not I make other people happy, if I have a no, that's what it is. By honoring my no, when I get to yes, I'm all in. So there's yes and no currents in the energy. And then there's emotional, mental, and physical levels, and they alternate. And this is where it's just not linear. It's not something you can measure in a tube. This is not something you can put in bullet points. You can't do statistical analysis on a relationship. And that is frustrating. But that is, as you perhaps remember, that's where the ego wants to capture things and know what's happening now and predict the future, rather than being open to what is. Now, different people have different levels of tolerance to serendipity, to being open to things. I traveled with a relative once who said, gosh, I've always wanted to travel like you. When you tell stories, I want to have this kind of stories that you tell. So we'll travel your way. And that's an example of, and I'm working ahead of myself into month 2, but that's an example of living in fantasy, because the truth is that they didn't have the personality to put up with not knowing what was going to happen in 4 hours or the next day. But silly me, I believed them. I took them at their word, and I planned the trip in my serendipity way. I remember we were on the airplane. We were going to Europe, and we were on the airplane, and they saw me reading the guidebook, and they said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm figuring out what we're going to do after tomorrow." And it's one of those joke moments. I should have known right there and then we had a problem, because they had a real problem with the fact that I hadn't plotted out even the first 3 days of a 2-week vacation. But my joy always came from, we might find a place we like better, or we might want to stay instead of move on. So it's just me, I want a lot of flexibility. I don't like to have to rush to get to a certain place because the reservations were made 3 months ago. But they liked having reservations 3 months prior. So that the happiness of that vacation never got off the ground, and it came to a screeching halt in a week and a half. And I realized how I'd misjudged, and we did the last 4 or 5 days their way, because I'd pushed a little bit too hard. It wasn't lack of love. It wasn't lack of consideration. They really thought that they understood what it took to live like me. But until you walk in somebody's shoes, you don't really know what the trade-offs are. So I was trying to illustrate a little bit that there are emotional, mental, and physical levels in these alternating stages, these energetic aspects. And it's why it's important, and the guide stresses this over and over and over. It's very important to be present in the now. What is true now? I know what you thought 3 minutes ago, and what is true now. Because if you've realized and know what you thought 3 minutes ago needs to be adjusted. Can't just go forwards based on, I gave my word. Now, sometimes you do. And that's where the ego in its execution process needs to compromise a little bit on occasion. But if you compromise too much, you will not be happy. There needs to be a place where your needs, your longing, who you are is respected and honored. And the first person to do that is not the outside world, not as adults. First person to do that now is you. So we have to take on the job that we have outgrown. I mean, we've outgrown needing parents, but there needs to be a parenting that happens from within, a way where we can understand how to parent ourselves so we can give ourselves what we need. So that was the first month. You can see why this is a big lecture. The second month was all about the section 3. It was 1, 2, and 3. All of section 3 was about what prohibits mutuality, what gets in the way. So inner negativity interferes with mutuality. And the guide quote that I want to read is, mutuality can exist only to the degree the individuals involved are aware of and in contact with their previously hidden destructive side and evil. So in other words, I cannot be mutual with you if I am ignorant of my own nonsense. I cannot be in mutuality with you if I'm harboring hatred that I have repressed to the point where I don't even know it's there. That's mutuality on a very superficial level. So inner negativity of any kind interferes with mutuality. The second week, we looked at finding our inner no. Once again, take finding your inner no, do a whole weekend workshop on that. And it's good to verbalize, it's good to be energetic, it's good to have exercises where you shout and you do things because it moves the energy. But the real point of that kind of work is when you move the energy, very often you move the superficial out of the way and you discover more significant truths that really do hide just below the surface. But you need to move that energy out of the way, move the superficial, have some fun, have a laugh or two, run around a little bit before you can access the deeper parts of you. So finding our inner no is part of addressing this inner negativity. And there's a lecture that I referenced several times in the 2 months, and that is transition from the no current to the yes current, which outlines what is the no current, the energetics of no, and the energetics of yes, and that's Patrick Lecture 125. Then there's mutuality in relationship. Now, why would that be in a section on what inhibits mutuality? But anybody who's been in a relationship knows that it's easier to think about it than do it. And it's easier to do things by yourself than with somebody a very large portion of the time. There's a paradox here. In Patrick Lecture 180 on relationship, the guide stresses the importance of relationship, how it is a tremendous accelerant of personal growth and development. A lot of people who are single, and I've been single during my journey in pathwork, it makes you feel like, well, but what about me? Am I wrong? Do I have to find relationship to find spiritual development? I don't read the lecture that way. I read it as relationship is a norm. Relationship is the natural progression of things, and I've had relationships. And I do have relationships. So I've learned to teach relationship in terms of capital R, big, important, intimate, spouse, partner, wife, husband. And so capital R, small r. Everybody has relationships. So anytime you read something about relationships, if you're not in one, or if you're in one and it doesn't bring these things up, look at the other relationships in your life. And we can be in relationship with systems, with institutions, with organizations, just as we can be in relationship with individual colleagues, we can be in relationship with a management group. We can be in relationship with a nation, with a culture. We can be in relationship with nature. The feedback mechanism is not as challenging, and that's why a lot of people go that way. It's not a mistake, it's not wrong. It is, however, I think important to acknowledge that we're trying to slow things down by choosing to, if we choose to raise relationship with nature into a central part of our life, that we may be declaring that we need to work in a more isolated fashion most of the time with an entity that follows natural law rather than human beings that follow free will. It's easier. No harm in that. And important to acknowledge that that will slow things down a little bit. And slowing things down could, of course, eventually accelerate them. So it is impossible to judge what someone's best spiritual path could be. It's a fool's errand to try to evaluate what someone should be doing. So mutuality and relationship, you've got the 3 gradations. So if you're in one gradation and your partner is in another, you may get a lot out of that relationship. In history, there's a lot of historical stories. They tend to emphasize, I'm going to use some pretty crude words here, a smart professional man and a less educated, more family-centric female. But as we learn more about history, we are learning about the stories where the woman was the powerhouse, the intellectual driver of a situation, and the man just had the job, brought the money, and held the position. So looks can be deceiving. But what I'm saying is you can have an unmatched pair, and it's going to cause some stress. Some needs aren't going to get met. If you're happy with that and it works for you, then you are in a successful relationship. You define what is successful and what is not. However, you may need to continue to get your needs met in various other situations, meaning you may need to put more energy into your profession because your home life is limited to a certain layers of conversation or outlets. So what I was bringing here was in the 3 layers, you can be matched, or you can have somebody who's a little bit ahead, and even that can have some tension, where somebody's doing better than you are on a spiritual level. You may feel that you have to hurry up, and it puts tension that can help, and it can hold you back. So mutuality in relationships, in gradations. And this is where the guide spent more time in terms of fantasy. The problem with fantasy is that we create an image. It's like we create a little movie about how someone is and how we can interact. And then we go to them, and it's as if we are projecting the movie on top of them. And the worst possible situation is we don't notice the difference, at least at first. So if we don't notice the difference, then we allow ourselves to imagine that we're seeing the truth, that this is real, that this is real relationship, real mutuality, instead of the other person being actively submissive, meaning they're going to fit our image. But that tension of fitting into somebody else's image of who you should be gets old after a while. So fantasy and relationship, it is important to understand where you're not grounded in how you perceive the other person, where you're not imagining who they are and what they think. I've had a number of examples in my life where people will hear a part of my history, and they will make statements that indicate that they've just taken off with their own ideas. So if I tell them that my father was an officer in the Air Force, they see me as, they may translate that into I'm the child of a Marine drill instructor, because that's what they know about the military. And they visualize my upbringing. They visualize how my father behaved to me, and they will say things. And I don't know what they're talking about. My father was a logistician. My father took care of material movement. He took care of warehouses. He got materials to Turkey. He got materials to France. That was his job. It was very much part of the business of the military. The military is quite a extensive organization. There's room for a lot of different professions in it. But what I'm expressing is that if I simply say I'm the daughter of a military officer, some people just imagine what that is, and they superimpose that on me and my upbringing, and then they interpret what I say to match their preconception. They are in fantasy. And they don't ask, well, was it more military or was it more, they don't ask those questions. They may not even know about the differences. They may not know the variety of professions within the military. So it's a small example of how fantasy inhibits relationship. You can't be in relationship with me if you're imagining how I was raised or interpreting what I say based on an image that you're holding. And then we come to groups. Mutuality in relationship includes mutuality in groups. And so the last section was mutuality in group work. There's a book, a slim book that I recommend over and over again. When I do meetings with people, I reference things and I put them in the folder so they can download them with the notes. And I have a little folder marked frequent downloads, so I don't have to go searching for it. Like there's not slightly over 90 items, and I send them out all the time. I use them constantly. I refer to them constantly. And one of them is a book called Emotional First Aid by Haldane, Haldane. And the book is about how we attempt to band-aid other people to make ourselves feel good. I find it to be a readily understandable way to help groups understand to stand down. That just because someone is upset and crying does not mean they need to be taken care of. That there's a place where what we're trying to do is we're starting to feel uncomfortable, and so we want the crying to stop. And that's why it's emotional first aid. It's first aid for you, so I don't have to see your blood. That's not love, and that's not mutuality. That's not being present to what the other person may need in the moment. And so these are the kinds of non-pathwick reference materials that I pull from because they're very good practical examples of these somewhat more abstract concepts. So these are all the segments in the 2 study guides. Even though they're in 2 different places, I tried to explain the relationship between the stages of commitment, which are under additional concepts on my website, it's another webpage, versus this one on mutuality. Some people read the lectures in sequence, the way they were given. However you want to read lectures is up to you. But what I find is that these lectures were delivered in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And it's 2022. Some of these ideas have come in from various sources over the last 50, 70 years. We know some of them. We don't have, this is not our first experience. Whereas for some people in the room listening to the guide, it may have been their first experience of some of these concepts, and not easy to swallow. So you may find that some lectures go down easier. You read it and go, yeah, I don't think I have a problem with that. And other lectures, you may have to struggle with. It's fun to have a lecture that you really get and look at all the nooks and crannies. That's fun. And I think that a lot of the people who actually work with me had that feeling with mutuality. I think they felt met in where they already were. So it's been quite a ride. It's been an interesting 3 months. For September, I even decided to have a little fun. So there's one lecture that has an impish title, and it's Obstacles in the Path, Wrong Guilts, and Who Me. That's not the exact name, but close enough. But it's the Who Me that I thought, well, that might follow up on mutuality. Let's do a little odds and ends cleanup. So I feel that the cycle is continuing over 4 months, and especially because I hadn't planned it like that, it's been an organic process for me as well. I hope you take a look at the lectures. That's my goal in doing this. So thanks for listening. If you've gotten this far, appreciate it. Thank you.